And there we have it. I love
Julie,
technology. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to ask, how many people are on right now?
We have 66 people and they're coming, joining us. So I'm going to keep admitting them. People are coming on continuously. So
Okay.
we're up to 70 now.
Woo!
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yes,
Congratulations.
absolutely. All right. Well, a few housekeeping items before I introduce our speaker today. We have a few more virtual events coming up in one more in October, a couple in November, and then in a couple in December as well. As you all, those of you that have attended these events regularly know that we kind of take a break in January, but we have a full schedule for the rest of this year. On October 20th, we have an event titled Evolution of Overnight Accommodations. This is going to be presented by Leslie Wolfenden, who is the THC coordinator for historic surveys. Following that, on November 10th at 6 p.m., we will present an event titled Interpretation of Offense by Bryant Celestine. Bryant is the Historic Preservation Officer of the Alabama Coshada Tribe of Texas. We have another event on November 17th, which is going to be presented by Rick Quezada, who is the Historic Preservation Officer for the Isleta del Sur Pueblo Tribe of Texas. The title for that event and the description will be up on our website pretty soon. And then in December, we have a couple more events coming up. Registration for most of these events is open on our website, so please do check those events out, read the descriptions. We hope you'll be able to join us. And as always, during the holiday season in December, we're going to have a very special Foodways event for you, which we will be putting information up about pretty soon. So please do join us for those. We would appreciate it if you could keep your microphones on mute, and your cameras can be on or off as you see fit. I would recommend that you switch your viewing option to speaker view, and you can do that by hovering your mouse on the top right corner of your Zoom screen. You'll see a little button that says view. Click on that and just click on speaker view. This is for the rest of you that are attending, not for Mary Margaret. I've given her a different option. So please do that for optimal viewing. And we have a Q&A planned at the end. Some of you have submitted some questions during the registration process. We will pull those up and share those with Mary Margaret, and hopefully she can answer some of those questions. There were some that were outside the parameters of the presentation tonight, and so she may not be able to answer those, but we'll present those questions to her. If you have other questions, you can drop them in the chat, and we will be screening those as we go along and share them with Mary Margaret. So it is now my privilege to introduce our presenter today. And I say this all the time, but it feels like it's important to share that the Friends of the THC's motto is preserving the real places and the real stories of Texas. And so storytelling is key to the work of historic preservation. It's the key to the work that we do at the Friends. And our presenter today is a consummate storyteller. She's written several books. Mary Margaret McAllen is the Director of Humanities at the Witte Museum in San Antonio. She was raised on a storied South Texas ranch. Her previous 3 books include the award-winning and best-selling I Would Rather Sleep in Texas, which was published in 2003, A Brave Boy and a Good Soldier, John C.C. Hill and the Texas Expedition to the Mier, which was published in 2006, and Maximilian and Carlotta, Europe's Last Empire in Mexico, which was published in 2014. She has appeared on the PBS series History Detectives and has contributed to Henry Louis Gates' Faces of America. After earning her MA in history, Mary Margaret taught as an adjunct professor of history at the University of Texas at San Antonio, and her latest book is James Ferdinand McCann, Painting a Historical Portrait of Texas, 1895 to 1925. So again, please make sure you're in speaker view so that you can see the presentation well. And Mary Margaret, thank you so much for taking time to be with us this evening and for sharing your stories and your knowledge with all of us. and it is all yours. So you can go ahead and share your screen now, and I'll confirm that it's all working okay. Yep, you're on.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. I hope you can see what I'm seeing. I see also on the feed, I see so many friends, and thank you. I'm so grateful for all the collaborations I've had over these last few years, and so grateful. And I'm ready to answer any questions y'all have. You can even interrupt me if you'd like. Anything is on the table. So anyway, this book came out. This derived from an effort from my grandmother, who started this effort in the 1970s. She was on the board of the Witte, and she loved history, and just felt like we needed to tell more about our family history. Our archives went back to the 1790s, and sadly, my grandmother passed away in 1995, and she asked me if I could continue her work. And when I started, I was reading her drafts on a consistent basis. I was a student at UT Austin, and she said, "Can you finish this work? I'm not going to survive much longer." She had emphysema, and so after she passed, I went into what they had it was an old fashioned sort of cottage on the ranch, and even had a parlor, and even her teacup was still there. So it was as though she had just walked out of the room. And so she said, "Can you continue this on?" So I looked through all of the records and the manuscript she had produced, and determined that there was so much more that had to be told about South Texas history that was not known. And it was in our family records. And so started going back through so many skirmishes and wars, lacing them together, but also how the family survived through those times. So here's a picture of this 2004 book that Texas State Historical Association published. And these are my forebears, James Bailey McAllen, John McAllen. And John McAllen had married into the very prolific Bailey family. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more. Let me bring it back to 1750, to the status of what was going on with New Spain and France, and the race to claim territory in North America. Many people blame one or the other, what would you say, discoverers of the New World. But the truth is, it was a massive campaign to come into what was thought very uncivilized, vacant territory. And so you can see in 1750, let me just back up and say that occupation of Mexican territories happened in 1519. So by this time, the Spanish had been in the New World and in New Spain for quite some time. Their goal was to hold off further French encroachment into Spanish Texas. And what they could do to do that was to plant people. and to establish independent sort of, what would you say, communities that could stand on their own, and suddenly it would become new, what would you say, communities of Spanish Texas. So, and if I'm going too fast, you all can ask questions, but eventually New Spain, after being in Mexico City and Mexico in the Seno Mexicano for many years, appointed this, he was a count, José de Escandón, and he was assigned to colonize Nuevo Santander, or the Seno Mexicano. Seno Mexicano means the bosom of Mexico. And so he comes to North Mexico, what we think of as northern Mexico today, which then was just part of New Spain. Texas was still part of New Spain. And he comes to the Rio Grande and he establishes communities all up and down the banks of the Rio Grande. And these include Camargo, Reynosa, Mier, Revilla, south of the Rio Grande, and north was Laredo and other small towns along the Rio Grande. And they brought settlers up from the middle, or the Seno Mexicano, the bosom of Mexico. They brought them up with incentives for land, what would you say, possession. They brought them up to the Rio Grande, and they established these about 20 settlements along the Rio Grande over time. So the incentive was that if these people were good settlers, and let me just say, they came up with military, who established military garrisons, and also the church. So they were supported by certain institutions that came up from Mexico City and Mexico, the interior of Mexico, so they could go ahead and establish and feel safe in these regions. And let me say that there were still Native American Indian depredations along, they called them depredations, meaning invasions or incursions of people they didn't know. So there was some fear, but these people were supported in these communities. So these people came in, and after 10 years, if they applied for a porción or a grant, they could what was called occupy or make better those porciones or these grants. And they could say, they could go out to those places and dig hand wells. They could do all of what was called improvements. And they would, what was called, denounce the land when they received it, meaning it was worthless, and they would then improve it. So many of them, after 10 years of occupation and improvement, then could take possession of the land. And this was the case with, I'm going to point out with my pointer here, one of the biggest beneficiaries of this system was the Bailly family and the Hinojosa family. So here is Padre Island, and the mother of Padre Nicolas Bailly was Doña Rosa Maria Hinojosa de Bailly. She married into the Bailly family. who was very adept at applying for these major grants. And we're talking hundreds of thousands of acres. But Doña Rosa Maria applied for these, and she ran. I mean, her husband died shortly after, and she became one of the greatest landowners. So these people, when they would get this land, that it was very personal to them. They would go out to their land. They would, there was a ceremony involved, often with a priest nearby. They would pull grass in the 4 cardinal directions. They would send the grass out into the wind. They would say prayers. They would throw stones. They would do these things to take possession of the land. And soon after they were able to do that, they set up, what would you say, it was different than the impresario grants in that they could go ahead and improve the land and have as many cattle and horses as they wanted to have. And so these lands, the major grants came in a bit later than these porciones. And these porciones were established so that people would have access to the river, to water, and then they could have potreros or other lands back up into this region. So they could have a garden, they could have a place to graze, they could have whatever they needed, but they could get to the water. And the ejidos were shared lands oftentimes, not always, but often. So here's Reynosa, and these people could use a shared garden at this place. So anyway, these major grants were granted after these porciones, and not always, but many times. And they were very politically dispersed. So here is some of the major places that were established well by 1790. This is my home right here, Santa Anita, which was much later divided. So going on to show, Austin colony came in about 1820s, 30s. As you know, probably most of you know about the old 300 coming in to, these people were coming in from the east. But even though they established, and Austin went down to Mexico to apply for the right to settle, there was not a real mixing of people at that time. The old 300 got their grants. They established their lands, some with slaves, some not with slaves. It just sort of depended on the people. And here in the hill country, many Germans were coming in at the same time. This is in the 1830s. But by the same time, steamboat operators were starting to come in to the region. Here's another map of that whole situation. I'm sorry if it's a little blurry. But steamboat operators were starting to come in to the lower Rio Grande to bring out manufactured goods, raw materials, even manufactured materials, all sorts of materials were being brought in and out, mostly to trade into Mexico, even though it was still New Spain. And well, by then it was Mexico after 1821. By 1836, the Republic of Texas was established. So there was a whole new emphasis on this prime waterway. And many little towns developed off of those major towns that that had been established by Escandón. So here we get all sorts of little towns across the whole region. And Boca del Rio became very important. You know, Padre Island was called Brazos de Santiago at that time. It's now known as Padre Island, but it was an important bulwark to the actual landing of Europeans, all sorts of people starting to maybe tickle their way into South Texas. I want to just back up here and just say that here is Isla del Padre. Rosa Maria Hinojosa de Bahia had 3 sons, and they were all anti-crown. And they hid horses on Padre Island, and she was pro-crown, and this no doubt caused her horrible agony. But the whole region started to want independence, and this is what they got in 1836 when the Republic of Texas was established. There were many incursions over those 9 years into Texas, including the raids of Lipatitlan, the Grass War, there were the Runaway Scrape. And so with time, Texas, the Republic of Texas said, no more. We and it was a real turmoil for the men who had established the Republic of Texas to say, we will embrace the United States. We will become a state. We will give the border controversies to the United States of America. So Zachary Taylor, I'm sorry, this is a little blurry. By the spring of 1846, Zachary Taylor's army had taken possession. It was about a third of the U.S. Army, 2,600 soldiers had come to take possession of Padre Island, northern Padre Island. And Zachary Taylor started marching north. This was all under James Polk, a very controversial movement, part of Manifest Destiny. That's another story. But Zachary Taylor's army takes possession of the region in 1846, I'm sorry, and they march south until they reach the point of what was called Fort Texas. And Fort Texas was some of the first skirmishing grounds of the Mexican War. And one of the first fatalities was Jacob Brown. And Jacob Brown, his name was honored at Fort Texas then as Fort Brown. By then, in this Mexican War, which the population of the whole lower Rio Grande had not seen many foreigners, Anglos coming into the region. They had seen some with these early steamboaters like Mifflin King and Mifflin Kennedy and Richard King coming up the Rio Grande to export items. So these families had been really isolated. And so for the first time during the Mexican War, like I was mentioning, here comes the incursion of many, many Anglo and European settlers for the first time into this very isolated pocket of Spaniards and what they considered themselves criollos, in other words, Creoles, meaning Spaniards born in the New World. And one of those is Salome by Young, the McAllen. She married a Scotsman who had come into the region in the 50s and became a merchant. And but he had gotten his start actually a bit earlier in Matamoros as a sutler and a provider to the soldiers of the Mexican War. She had come, her family had come to the region in 1750. Her father was Francisco Bailly, who had been raised by Padre Nicolas Bailly as he was either an orphan, we don't know, or an hijo de crianza, which an hijo de crianza is often a person who is raised by another person who had means to take care of a child, where the original parents did not have those means. It was not uncommon. Anyway, so her father was raised by Padre Nicolas, and she had a number of siblings who became merchants in the area and journalists. Francisco ran the local newspaper. So Salome Bailly is married to John Young, and being a merchant, they were making quite a bit of money, and people back in, I'm going to back up here and show you the Porciones maps. Okay, so Matamoros is down here, and a lot of people did not, they had rights, derechos, in their grants, their land grants, but they didn't know where they weren't conversant in, they were undivided rights. They didn't know, they had never visited their lands. A lot of it was because the land was unguarded and people didn't feel safe. There were also Indians coming through the region, or other, what would you say, raiders, what would you know, whatever. So people didn't really leave their properties to come to their own derechos. And then by the time, I would say by the time of the Civil War occurred, right before that time, people started establishing more of settlements on the north side of the Rio Grande. And this was largely because the army needed supplies. So here you have these ranch lands north of the Rio Grande, and people started raising more sheep, goats, horses, cattle throughout the region. So suddenly things were starting to expand from both sides of the region, and people would come up. I mean, these steamboats would come up the river to trade. And I'm sorry, excuse me. And so with the steamboat era, and when Lincoln secured every support necessary to block trade from the East Coast all the way around the Gulf Coast, there was no place left for cotton to go, Southern cotton, except Matamoros. And so all the cotton would come down this route and would go to Matamoros and cross the river. That about that time, these merchants were setting up in Matamoros. Here's a very old picture of a traditional home in Matamoros. This is actually John McAllen's, with the store in the bottom, and they lived in the top. These were barileros, who were bringing these entrepreneurs, bringing water to everybody in the region from the Rio Grande. And about that time, John McAllen appears in Matamoros and in the region just before the Civil War. Salome Bayi's husband dies, and this was in 1858. 2 years later, he marries Salome, who had been maintaining the whole company that they had by herself, and he had been their bookkeeper. He marries Salome and has one child with her. But the whole enterprise continues here. I'm sorry, I've kind of skipped back in time, but the whole, and this is called a chalan. This is the ferry, hand-drawn ferry across from Brownsville to Matamoros. Here you can see a horse getting off, and the steamboats ready to take whatever is needed out to the Rio Grande, and down, crossing the bar out to the Boca del Rio, where sometimes there'd be hundreds of ships waiting for cotton. And as I'm telling you, Lincoln blockaded every port. So the only way Confederate cotton or Southern cotton could get out was coming down to Brownsville, lading on these ships, going down to the river, and then loading for months. And they would go out to Manchester and Antwerp and and Nantes and so many ports in Europe. During the Industrial Revolution, cotton became the all be all. It was comfortable and wonderful, and people wanted cotton. And like, for example, France couldn't get cotton because of a silver shortage. So all these men, Charles Stillman came, who arrived in the valley. His legacy is now known as City Court. Francisco Ituria, who worked with them, Richard King, Mifflin Kennedy, all worked to send cotton to Europe during this time. In the case of John McAllen, who I just showed you, he remained an Irish citizen. Salome remained a Mexican citizen. So some of the same rules did not apply to them after the Civil War. But on the other side of the Rio Grande was the French. Mexico was occupied by Maximilian and his wife Carlota. Maximilian von Habsburg was an Austrian prince, and his wife Carlota was a princess, the first princess of Belgium. And so right across the river, under Tomás Mejía, a general, was the French. So the French also were really desiring this cotton, and the aduana, which was the customs house of Matamoros, produced the majority of the income for the Mexican empire. And they fought to maintain it and protect it. Here's a steamboat, how they would load these bales up to the gills and float them out over the sandbar at the river, and they'd go out to this forest of masts, hundreds of yachts and steamships waiting for this cotton. And cotton was being paid for at a premium at this time. And at the end of the Civil War, in fact, every soldier on each side, and keep in mind, Fort Brown changed hands 5 times during the Civil War between the Confederacy and the Union. They all wanted a bale of cotton. it was extremely valuable, more valuable than gold. Here's a picture of the Andrew Ackley. This was a steamship that, well, it's an example of one that after months of lading bales of cotton, the ships would then run an ad in the newspapers. And let me add that Brownsville was such a cosmopolitan place. It had settlers from all over. So the newspapers were printed in English, Spanish, German, and French. And they would, in fact, there were the boulangeries, the French bakeries were very prominent in this region. The people in that area had an amazing, unique accent from the cosmopolitan manner of that whole town. Anyway, so as the ships filled up with cotton and other goods, people could go and book passage to Europe. And so they would advise the population through the newspapers, we have room for 30 people or 50 people or what have you. And they would book passage. So here's a woman standing with her shawl ready to go, I guess, to the mouth of the river. But you can see, I'm sorry, in this, let me go back. Sorry, you can see the firewood. It looks like mesquite to me, that would fuel the steam engines. So there were people like Mifflin Kennedy who profited greatly by this this trade. He married a woman named Petra Resendes Bella Vidal Kennedy, and they became very wealthy during this time. Petra had 6 children from, she was from a very wealthy family, daughter of a general in Mexico. And she married her husband, not sure, but she married Mifflin Kennedy and had another 6 children. Only one, but those 6 she had made it past the age of 35. One of those children actually married my great aunt, Corina Bailly. And anyway, they went on to found a ranch that is about 250,000 acres in South Texas. But they also established a number of wonderful businesses that the family could follow after that time: cattle, horses, railroads. So in the 1880s, when I'm saying the Kennedys were doing what the Kings did and my family, they all moved to their ranches in about the 1870s after the Civil War. With them, in many cases, were the indigenous people, the people who had lived in the region for centuries. They became vaqueros. They became really wonderful at producing cattle. They assimilated their cattle over sometimes 2-3 years, and they established the whole institution of driving the cattle up the trails from the Rio Grande. There was a lot of cattle depredation going on. The Mexicans said the Texans stole from them. The Texans said the Mexicans stole from them. But the truth is they would assimilate these herds and after a few years drive them up the trail to Abilene, Kansas, Dodge City, and other places. In fact, these 2 people had one child married to my aunt. His name was James Kennedy, known as Spike, and he accidentally shot a woman in Dodge City. He eventually died at their ranch called La Parra. but anyway, the whole legacy of this herding cattle, you know, what would you say, driving them up the trail, living on the trail, continued on until, I mean, I myself went on these sort of drives through larger ranches, and there were chuck wagons, and my grandfather would go and sleep out under the stars. We would drive cattle and sometimes not come back for days. This cattle sort of tradition carried on until the late 1970s, at least. So anyway, I just wanted to say that, you know, in the 1880s, people started living on their ranches. They had schools, they had churches, they had commissaries, they had kitchens, and the people enjoyed certain community life. And so here's a picture taken, this was taken by my great grandfather, of some of the people at the Santa Anita. Here's another one. You know, of course, people always ate tortillas, but sometimes if you get really great sort of white flour, they would make a special kind of bolillo. And here is a woman making that sort of bread for the ranch, which was a very much a specialty. And the isolation continued until about 1917. There was no permanent border protection. There was the random protection of various rangers or military people until 1917, when the troops started training for World War I, and they came to Santa Anita to do drilling. The young family went out to meet them. They provided coffee, and they took these pictures. So there was no real protection. It was all survival. There was no penicillin, no real, you know, what would you say? All protection was sort of personal, and there was no really, I mean, and people could sort of direct their lives as they wished, but for better or worse. So that in a nutshell is survival there in this very isolated region. So here's my family in 1922, still living this isolated life. Here's you know, mules pulling the wagon. There were no paved roads until in fact, my father lived by kerosene light until 1947. We didn't have electricity. So that in a nutshell is how I've kind of tried to bring it from the macro to the micro. And anything you'd like to ask, I'm here.
Thank you so much, Mary Margaret. It's fascinating to me. When I learn more about the cultures, the sort of the melding of cultures that was happening in the Rio Grande Valley back, you know, 150, 200 years ago, it's fascinating. It's really incredible. And it's so much a part of Texas history, even though, as you mentioned, that area was very isolated for a good long time. We do have some questions that we are going to start off with. So I'm going to share these with you. And for those of you that have additional questions, please drop them in the chat box. My colleague Carrie and I will keep monitoring those questions as well, and we'll share them with Mary Margaret. So I wanted to start with a question from Chris Smith. He asks, did the Comanche or other Indian tribes raid or influence this region?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I study at the Witte Museum. We study all the time the Huahuitecan. It was an amalgamation of tribes, but yes, the more organized tribes like the Comanche and the Lipan Apache raided as they could into the region. And so I think that's what made, for a period of time, the mission system and the what would you say, the church system work really well to protect these people. Now, along the lower Rio Grande, there were Kickapoo and the Carancawa were able to move, I think, more resiliently, and then eventually assimilate. And so it was hard for them. Yes, I mean, it was a terribly difficult situation for those smaller bands, less organized bands of Indians. So yes, you're right.
I'm sorry, I was on mute and talking to myself. Brenda Maston asks, did the Texas Rangers patrol these areas at any given point?
The Texas Rangers were called in by the governors of Texas at various times because there was no permanent law enforcement. So they were a special force, and they were called in to do duty up until, of course, till 1916 and after. A lot has been said about the abuses of the Rangers, but I must say that there was no other law enforcement entity, so I think the governors called them in to help halt violence on in certain circumstances. And I just have to say that no violence, no war is justified. But my understanding of those situations was that there were brutalities in many instances, and true. I'm not trying to say that the Rangers weren't brutal. They were. We had a raid on our ranch in 1915, and one of our ranch workers, who I knew very well before he died, he said to me, he said, you know, there was no law enforcement anywhere, and the Rangers were bad, but these guys, the raiders, who were wearing German crosses, they were worse. And so, you know, we didn't live then, but I must say that this man, Salvador Gutierrez was his name. He tried to quiet his horse and stop the horse from, and the horse was changing its ears. It could hear these guys coming from, and they were from Mexico and wearing these German crosses. And he said, I was so scared. But then when the Rangers came, he was more scared. So it was not a great time, you know. Anyway, I know it's a very big controversy. I don't know really how to weigh in on that.
Thank you. Cedric Wood asks, did your great-great-great-grandfather originate the city of McAllen?
Yes. He didn't. It's a long story, but when the railroads came through with Uriah Lott in the the 20th, 19th and 20th century, there was a porción that Salome owned. And for some reason, they called it McAllen Station, and it didn't. So for the railroad, it didn't transport people. It transported truck crops for the first time that had gotten started in the around the turn of the century. People would have larger farms and ship the onions or cabbage or whatever. So and people had started pumping water up by windmill and then by other methods to irrigate the farms. So there was a railroad stop called McAllen Station, and then a town grew up around it. It didn't have much to do with my family, but it's the name stuck, and that's it. I mean, we didn't have much to do with its development, but it was just a place on a map, if you will.
Thank you. Martha asks, how many people received land grants from Escandón?
Escandón, oh, I would say just a handful, not even 100. Just, under 100. I don't know for sure. We'd have to consult the Texas Land Office. They would know for sure. But those families were pretty prolific, and yeah. And
did this happen during the land grants from Stephen of Austin, or during his time, or was this before that?
Way before, 80
Wow.
years before.
Oh,
and,
wow.
And it was interesting because those people had to have political pull with the viceroys and the counts who managed that region. And it's still sort of a mystery how but there were not that many people around, and life expectancy was very short.
Mhm.
And so, it's interesting that a lot of those people made their money otherwise, like as merchants, and then they had enough money to send people out into the field to improve the land and to dig water wells, and they didn't fence them, but they did other things, build shelters, and they just had just enough money to do what the Spanish government wanted them to do, and to, what would you say, defend the land and maintain it. And that's all I think the Spanish government wanted to do, to fend off the French. And in fact, Spain prevailed, then didn't prevail, then prevailed, and then 1803, the Louisiana Purchase happened, and I think a lot of that pressure went away. But it started in 1850, ended, I think right around 1803.
All right. Pam Stranahan asks, what about settlements all the way to north to San Antonio River? Were there settlements that went all the way to that edge of the river?
Absolutely. But that was a different viceroy, and that was different settlement pattern. But let me just say, the same situation happened. I mean, and those lands were settled on the mission system a lot of times. Then the Battle of Medina happened in 1813, biggest, bloodiest battle in Texas history. A lot of that left women holding all of the ranch lands. So yes, it was a later settlement from Escandón, but just as important. And those people, I have a very good colleague, Amy Porter, who's done a lot of research on those women ranchers, and those people who, the men who died at that Battle of Medina, their sons, their wives and children were taken into sort of captivity by the Spanish and forced into almost slave labor. And those are the same people she's determined, that fought at the Battle of the Alamo to fight for independence. First it was from Spain, and then it was from Mexico. So it's sort of a different dynamic, but interestingly, these people found that they could sustain themselves, and they didn't want Spanish or Mexican intervention. And it was sort of taxation without representation, but from the South.
Got it. Chris Science has a question, which is, why is Hispanic heritage or Hispanic heritage history so limited compared to Anglo history in Texas? Is there a reason for that?
Well, that's changing, I think, I hope. It's interesting. A lot of my family members went to school in the East, and they would do papers about settlement from the South, from Mexico, and the professors didn't believe them. But it's a real thing, and it's not that new. I mean, Herbert Bolton first wrote about it, 80 years ago, and it's just lore and people's indoctrinations. But the truth of the matter is that people came here from all places with their families, and they assimilated, and a lot of people, well, the earliest settlers intermingled, and there weren't that many people around, if you think about it, and they were trying to survive and trying to do well in a region. Like John McAllen used to say, he'd write his relatives in Ireland saying, there's all sorts of opportunity here. Tell everybody to come and try their hand. I mean, there was no royalty here. There was no, restrictions. So it was a bold new opportunity for people if they could find a way to sell something or make something, or, it was open to all. So anyway, I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, thank you. Alicia asks if you can maybe speak to a little bit to any Spanish patriots who helped in the American Revolution from the area that you're talking about.
Oh, interesting. I love that question. Yes. And in fact, they were Spanish French sort of extraction. And Denis was his name. He, Joseph Denis, and he, once Spanish Texas got established and they started raising cattle, interestingly, during the American Revolution, those animals were driven to places like Florida and to the East Coast as food supplies for the American Revolution. It was such an interesting time. And you think of these people as being so isolated by land, water, but they weren't. They got along up the trails, down the trails. People even shipped cattle by steamboat later. Just interesting times that things took time, but they got around really pretty fast. And so the Spanish Texans made a lot of money selling their beeves and horses during the American Revolution. So interesting times.
Thank you. So we have several additional questions in the chat box. I'm going to just go down the list as we read them. Tim Dalby asks, this was the homeland of the Carrizo Comecrudo. Any mention of that tribe in the in history books?
Yes, of course. What we found is that the Coahuitecans when the Spaniards came to South Texas, they documented probably hundreds of little small bands. Come Crudos were one of them. They were usually, as is Spanish language, they were described by their physical and what would you say, philosophical, their way, and Come Crudos were one of them. So yes, they were one of the many tribes. I'm not sure you can call it a tribe more than a band, but the Spaniards documented many of these groups, and they tried to record their languages as well. In fact, we had two ladies come up from Saltillo a couple of years ago from the University of Monterey. Well, they lived in Monterey and Saltillo, and they showed us the recordings of the Spaniards of the languages of people like the Come Crudos, and they converted the language into the sacraments, of course. So these people were real. They were living. They were people like us. They're still here. They've assimilated over time, and they maybe not took on to Catholicism. But yes, they were here, and I've seen many references to them in those Spanish colonial days. What happened to them eventually is still yet to be unearthed. Hope I answered that question.
Thank you. Cindy asks, when did the transition from cattle to oil occur in the area, and how did that change the culture?
Oh, interesting. It was a turn of the century to the 20th century. People started leaving their lands, sort of exploring oil. Spindletop happened right after the turn of the century. Oil was discovered way before, in Pennsylvania. But also, interestingly, there were tar deposits that would wash up on Padre Island that were from seeps and the Indians would use those seeps, that tar, to secure their arrows to their bows. And so petroleum was known for some time, but it wasn't systematically with the pipe going into the formation and coming out until right at the turn of the century. And then by the 1930s, everything had changed. Urbanization with oil and people leaving their farms, and it's interesting. Electricity, just so many things going on, changed Texas forever. And so.
Thank you. Donna asks, was there strong resistance from Mexico to the formation of the Lone Star Republic in 1836?
Yes, absolutely. They between 1836 and 1845, they attacked Texas for 9 years, repeatedly crossing the Nueces and attacking and capturing people, burning out towns. It was really bad. But the problem for Mexico was that they had let people be independent for so long that and Spain too, they had tried to have a central government, so central that they couldn't control these outliers, these people who became very independent and very strong. They made their own way. They sold their own cattle. They had their own methods of trade. They didn't need the central Mexican government anymore. They could trade in cattle, they could trade in silver, they could trade in arms, they could trade in any way. And then when Austin's colony came in, it even gave them more, at least in San Antonio, more oomph to, you know, be able to say, hey, we're going to reject Mexico. Now, on the border, there was a bit of a different situation. They had been really independent for quite some time earlier. And a lot of times on the border, they saw independence as already a given for quite some time earlier, I think. Now, other historians might argue with me, but I think, in my opinion, they were so certain and settled and assured of their porciones, their land grants, that nobody could really take that away from them. The uncertainty was the more northern, right up at the Nueces and beyond, whether that was going to happen or not. Now, so anyway, those big battles didn't happen on the Rio Grande. What happened were more local skirmishes, and they were just as violent sometimes, but it wasn't centralized violence. So anyway, that's another whole discussion.
And Cesar asks, how did Juan Cortina's revolt, 1858 to 1861, affect or shape the region?
Oh my goodness, I think it confused people a lot. I think Juan Cortina was the heir of a great long legacy of inheritors of land grants there in the lower Rio Grande, and he was a caudillo, meaning a local boss, but he was not, I think, so consistent that people could read him. And so the Anglos that were coming in disdained him, but even the Baís disdained him because he wanted his way or the highway, and he didn't cement any sort of government. He had raiders who were with him. I think he killed indiscriminately. He just didn't make any sense to people. And but he was brave, and he was, but to some people he was a hero, to some people he was a madman. So it's interesting. But the thing that I think dogged Cortina more than anything is that he wasn't consistent in his aspirations. They changed. And in fact, when the Civil War began, he demonstrated the same thing, just like Adrian Vidal, who was Mifflin Kennedy's adopted son. He served on one in the Imperial Army and the Juarista Party, and just to shift it around to the confusion of many people, so much to people who wanted to be established and have, what would you say, a consistent business. It became very confusing and scary to them. So his actions, along with the transfer of power of Fort Brown, caused a lot of women and children to move away for a while because it got really scary. There was a militia, but they weren't all that effective, and Cortina couldn't be, what would you say, predicted. And he's still a legend in that region.
What's really interesting to me is through your presentation, and you focus a lot on the women in these stories, and it's really important to, I guess in my mind, important to recognize the role that these women, who were extremely strong and brave, the role that they played in settling those lands and sort of raising families that, that have sustained through generations. So I really appreciate that. And Jim Bass actually has made a plug for your book. He says that it so happens I purchased the book now shown, which is this one, I Would Rather Sleep in Texas, I think. And he says he found it to be fascinating as it seemed to be much more believable than a lot of fiction that has been written. He liked the description of the culture, the daily life of the people, and he highly recommends the book. So please go out and buy it. I'm gonna do it for sure and read it. Ronnie has a question. He says, it appears on the first map that you showed that the French claimed most of Texas. When did the Spanish and the French decide who had the claim to these areas? Was there a war
it went back,
decide
it
that?
was a series of treaties that went back and forth, and eventually, the French ceded the territory to France. I'm sorry, I'm getting that backwards. The French ceded that territory to Spain for a time, and Spain promised at some point that they would not dispense with that land. The French took it back, and then in 1803 there was the Louisiana Purchase, and that pretty much halted all of the interplay from 1750. Problem is that these countries were claiming these vast swaths of land and had no way to actually secure them. And Spanish were some of the first to actually send people out into the field to secure them, and sometimes successfully and sometimes unsuccessfully, but especially in East Texas, and which was a very foreign place to them. So by 1803, it was the Louisiana Purchase was secured. Lewis and Clark were sent out to survey the rest of it. So yes, you're right. I mean, it was a very, it was all kind of mapology, if you will. I mean, there was nothing secure about this area at the time. I mean, it was more secure on the East Coast and in Canada, but this region was up for play, up for grabs. So anyway, that's my take on it. People might disagree with me, but that's how I see it.
That's interesting. Cindy also asks, with the establishment of city charters along the river, how did that change ranch life?
It didn't really. These people couldn't leave really until, like I said, 1880. The charters, if there was a charter even, just secured the town for, ejidos, porciones, taxation, if there was even. It didn't change really much until the 1880s. And those towns actually sometimes moved around based on the flooding that happened along the Rio Grande during major hurricanes and what have you. So the city fathers acted. There were nominal taxes paid. You could even bring your livestock into town. There were matanzas. There were, the butcheries. There were markets. But what really happened after 1790 is that the people really had freedom to go and do more with their lands, and the towns built up. People had children. It was still a tough time for everybody, but in that they could expand their ranch lands, just made them all the more wealthy. It didn't happen for everyone. Families would have 14, 20 children. So, and there was no true monetary way. You have to see that between 1821 and 1845, the land tenure or the sovereignty of these lands changed over three to four times for these people. So their money changed. Silver became very important. And let me just reiterate, there weren't that many people. So city charters were somewhat important, but I think survival was people, still relied on the priests to do their legal work. People weren't that literate. So anyway, it was pretty much survival.
Great. And then Gustavo asks, are you familiar with the donativos given by Spanish citizens to support the American Revolution?
I'm not really, that's not one of my expertises, but I do know that the Spanish people supported in the way they could the American Revolution. Interesting. Certain French did too. It was an amazing kind of transitory time. I can only imagine what it must have been like, but thank you for that question.
And then there's a question from Uribe. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. Could you speak about the Vasquez Borrega land grant?
I don't know very much about that. That's something I should investigate more. And, I think it's a fascinating time. And these were all pioneers.
Thank you. Sharon has asked the names of the books. Sharon, I've dropped the list in the chat, and we will also put the list in our email that we send out with the Facebook Live link. So look for that as well. Let's see. There are a few more questions. Marilyn Whitworth had to sign off, but she said thank you, and she really enjoyed learning about the land acquisition and settlement along the Rio Grande. Carla asks, many people like my ancestors, Jose Vasquez Borrega, with the land grant Nuestra Sonora del Dolores, provided many cattle, horses, mules from the, is it East Texas Ranch to Don Bernardo de Galvez for the Battle of Mobile and in Florida. So she's sharing that information. Carla asks, was there resistance to the women running large operations?
No, I mean, they had rights. They had, which today we still enjoy in Texas. Women have more rights than probably anywhere in the country. And these women, they many times the men died from battle or ill health. The women got to run. Doña Maria Rosa Maria Hinojosa de Bahia is a great example, who had millions of acres and lots of power. And there's stories about these women going across land, going out to see their cattle. They would ride side saddle and sometimes not side saddle, sometimes full saddle. And they had hatchets. They wore hatchets on their belts. They had Michelet pistols. They well armed. They had forces of people that would go with them. They were in their own way caporales of their own sort, and they could defend themselves. And I think that's what makes a lot of women of South Texas and Texas in general pretty strong, because one, we have those community property rights, but secondly, it's a legacy of, when the man can't be there, you must take over. And it's something that we should teach our children and teach generations to come. And so, I mean, I have to say, women, because of their rights, had to rise to the occasion. Otherwise, I've seen many wills and many situations where other unsavory people would come in and try to take over, and it depended on the character and the not legacy, what would I say, the training and the heritage of the women. And I've seen it both ways. And so I think, Texas women, Southern women, Texas women particularly, have sort of a way about them. I like to think so. So anyway, that's my take.
Thank you. Kathleen was asking about the women on the cover of your book. Those, just to confirm, those are your ancestors, Mary Margaret, right? On the cover of I'd Rather Sleep in Texas.
Yes. Well, let me back up here if you all can still see the, oh, I can't go back. Let me see, go back. Yes, those are, okay, if I can go back, I'm sorry, I have to scroll through all this. Yes, the man raising his hat is James Witte McAllen, this man. His father is John McAllen from Ireland. His wife is right here, Margaret Rhodey McAllen. She was German. These are her sisters. He had a prior wife who was part of, her name was Orcinda de la Vega, and Ormecinda, and he didn't stay married very long, but they had children. So then he married her and they had children, and this is Mildred and this is Eldred, and they had 2 more children after that. I'm sorry, this keeps jumping around. So anyway, yeah, those are, and they're all a mix of Spanish, Irish, Scottish, German. And this is all, the women are all wearing Gibson girl outfits, and it looks like they're all yelling at James Witte for, posing. He was a great photographer. He loved photography. So anyway, I don't know, but I love the image and I wanted to put it on the cover of the book. So.
Thank you for that. Cindy was sharing in the chat that she did a documentary on the Llano Grande for the city of Weslaco, which is really interesting history as well. And she wishes you all the best.
Well, thank you.
Jimmy and Telma also saying great presentation. And I'm guessing this is Jimmy saying this, that his lineage traces back to the Porciones from Juan Jose Hinojosa on his mother's side. So maybe related, but he's congratulating you on the success of your publications, and says Mrs. Harwell, rest in peace, would be very proud of your accomplishments.
Oh, who said that?
Jim and Telma, he's waving. You know what? Let's get out of the share screen so that you can.
Oh, I see Jimmy and yes, Mrs. Harwell. She was my mentor. I loved her. Were you in her class, Jimmy?
There we go.
Yeah. Is this Jimmy Cantu?
I believe so.
Yes.
Hi, Jimmy.
Hey, yes.
Yeah, I miss Mrs. Harwell.
I learned everything from her.
Me too. Me too.
Set up the
best.
story, and that's why I talk too much. Set it up, talk about it, and conclude it.
I loved her.
Yeah.
So
yeah, was awesome.
It's old Bobcat high school time.
We go way back.
She was my favorite teacher ever, and I miss her. And I remember
she
how
was a
she
big
would,
influence on me too.
yeah, how she would doodle while we would talk on, I miss
Yeah.
her.
Well, I
Great
guess Cindy
presentation.
has the same high school as well, is from the same school as well, right, Cindy?
Yeah. I'm a year older than Mary Margaret and Jimmy. But yeah, Harwell, you definitely know every student that had Mrs. Harwell. And if you had semantics, we have a tendency to be pretty good public speakers and writers. So it's really pretty interesting to see Mary Margaret doing so well and seeing Jimmy Cantu. It's really pretty cool.
Yeah, and you're spot on, Cindy. You're spot on. Yes,
Yeah.
she was the best.
Yeah. She really was.
I think of her she changed my life,
Yeah.
really. And there was another woman at UT who changed my life as well, Maxine Hairston. But those two women, best ever. You couldn't buy teaching like that,
Well, did you have Miss Till too? Because her history classes were amazing.
Yes, I had her as well.
Yeah.
Those were my two, Miss Till in history and Miss Harwell, Mrs.
Yeah.
Harwell. They were two huge influences on me.
Yeah, I took Mrs. Till for advanced history, so we studied the King Ranch and studied all the ranches of South Texas. That was pretty amazing.
So Cindy, you may want to go to our Facebook page and go back to a presentation we had by Lilia Garcia, who talks about the presentation focuses primarily on her ancestor Francisco Uturia, who Mary Margaret talked about, but she also talks a lot about the King Ranch and the history of that ranch as well. So please do check that out. But we are 30 minutes over time. So this has been so much fun. Mary Margaret, thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge, all the information, all the stories that you shared. It's always fun to learn about Texas. I'm a transplant. I'm an immigrant to Texas. I've been here almost 30 years and I'm still learning and absorbing. So this is just incredible.
Yes,
Incredibly
but
fun for me.
as I told you, India is part of Texas history, as I'm figuring out in a new book I'm writing. So
well, I'm gonna wait for that and definitely read it and learn more. But thank you all for joining us.
Everyone.
And we will send out an email with a Facebook Live link. Please share it with friends and family that you think are interested in this history, and join us for our next event. Again, registration is open on our website, which is www.thcfriends.org. So with that, I'm going to bid you all a good night and thank you. Thank you, Mary Margaret, again.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, Mary Margaret. Ma'am, will the presentation be available?
Yes, we will be sending a Facebook Live link with the recording. Yes.
Hey, wonderful.
Please let me ask one thing. This lady, Carla Rubio, wrote about the Jewish people perhaps being in South Texas.
Oh, I missed that. I'm sorry. I will share that with, I'll share that with Mary Margaret for sure.
Yeah, there's a wonderful book about the Sephardic Jews in Monterrey when they were involved in the silver trade. It's called The Cryptic Jews of Monterrey, and they talk about all of that time in history. That they were people that claimed to be Catholic in the daytime, but secretly they were Jews. So it is very interesting to read about.
Yeah,
I am writing that down, Uribe, and I will for sure add that to the email that we send out. Thank you.
By all means, yes. The name of the book again is the Cryptic Jews of Monterrey.
Thank you. I will look for that and I'll find the author as well.
Okay.
Thank you so much. You all
Bye.
take care. Bye-bye.